Friends of .NET. So we are back with an API review. Hopefully it's working. Because Jeremy hasn't streamed in a while, so I totally blame him when it doesn't work. So I think today we'll start with, I think this is also part of the OpenTelemetry work, right? Or is it unrelated to that, Tarek?
No.
I didn't hear the answer because two people were talking.
Tarek, you go.
Yeah. Okay. Can you scroll down a little bit just to get the whole proposal? Yeah. Okay. So basically, if you remember, we have the activity class, which is used for collecting the tracing information, publishing tracing, and part of this proposal is about to add what we call it a status to the activity. Just a status to, it's kind of like indication if the operations that we are instrumenting is failed or succeeded. I mean, something like this. This is proposed. I mean, this is part of the OpenTelemetry specs, and this was proposed long ago, even during .NET 5, but it was not ready. I mean, in the good shape. I mean, just to port it to the .NET framework. And we had long discussion, I mean, with the OpenTelemetry about, like, you know, what should the status looks like, because originally they proposed to have like listing all possible, I mean, error codes inside the status, which cannot work. I mean, like for the .NET framework, because they were focusing on the GPC and RPC. I mean. And after discussing and taking like more consideration there, it's decided to be like more generic status. I mean, like, you know, telling if the operation is just succeeded or failed, and that's it. So status actually contains two things. I mean, what we call it the status code and just description. And description is arbitrary string you can put on the status. The arbitrary code, the status code is just the enum that listed in the top of the proposal here. It has just three values. Unset means that nobody cared about it or set it or did anything with it. And okay means that the operation kind of okay. It could be like succeeded, or it could be like there's some failures that it can be ignored or something like this. And third is the error, which is like there is some error happened. And usually, I mean, people who put the error, I expect them to also to put like some description to the string in the same time. So the proposal here is just introducing this activity status struct, which, as I mentioned, about containing these two properties. I mean, the code and description, and the activity class will have just some property which is called the status, which is you can get or set to it. We have a couple of alternative designs here, and I won't just go through it, but first, I mean, like, I want to see if there is any feedback so far for that before we see the alternative.
So one question I have is, I mean, I think we have this pattern elsewhere. I think HTTP, at least on the ASP.NET side, has a very similar pattern for the status codes. But is there any reason why we need both the enum and the struct? Could we just get away with just having the struct and then just expose the code as literally an int?
I don't think. So if we expose it as int, I mean, like, so this means that anybody can put any code there?
Well, I mean, I think your constructor can still validate, but I think it seems like under which circumstances would I have to compare the code against something strongly typed? Because I would think most of the time you're comparing the activity status itself against, you know, the well-known members on activity status. Like, why would I ever write status.code equals activity status dot something?
I think.
I mean, really, Tarek, I think the question is, what's the description for, and how often is it going to get used? Because that seems to be the reason that there's the struct, is so that there's this optional description hanging off, which I don't even see a way to add it, because there's no. Oh, it's up here.
Yeah, it's a constructor. You can construct the status passing the code and description you want, and you can set this to the activity after that.
Oh, I see. So it's not like each code has a well-known description. It's literally like I see. So you could have the same code but different descriptions. So equal would not return true.
That's right. Yes.
I see.
Yeah, I think with OK that's probably boring, but with error it's that you may have a useful description to go with it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like if you have, we are avoiding to put description, I mean, on a string on it ourselves, because like, you know, you will run into the localization issues at that time about like, if you put it English, I mean, people can complain about like, yeah, no, I'm German, like why I'm getting this in English, right?
Sorry, I didn't follow that. So if I get an activity status that says, you know, the equivalent of 200 OK, but OK is written in English versus in German, those won't compare equally?
The most important is the code itself. I need to see like if it is OK or not. The description, usually it will be propagated as part of the logs. It doesn't matter about like the meaning.
So the equality and get hash code checks do or don't factor in description?
This is a good question, but yeah, I didn't think about that.
So my understanding is that code is intended for comparison, and like you do some query. Description is only something that you want people to consume from the end user experience. They want to see some like rendered UI instead of doing any comparison. And I guess
if they don't, yeah, that makes sense. If the description then isn't included, this gets back to Emo's question and kind of Jeremy's question of why is the enum need to be there as well?
Yeah, I would also go a step further. I would do the other way around. Like I would say, if your intent is that the description is a user-supplied value, it seems almost wrong to not include it in the comparisons, because otherwise you construct two values. They have, you know, they literally have different contents, but then they compare equal because both happen to have a status of OK. In which case, if that is your intent, I would almost say get rid of the static properties or fields in your case and just replace them with factories, so that it's always clear that you get a different thing potentially. Because otherwise you have this problem that people might say, oh, is activity status equals activity status dot error? And then the answer is no, because the message happens to be different, right? But that was not the intent that the user wrote. But I think you will lead them down that path with this API shape. Like if you compare this to, let's say, ASP.NET, where they have factory methods called OK and error, and both of them take an optional string, then it's pretty clear that you wouldn't do that. You would just now dot into the activity status and say, oh, there's a code, and then I compare the code, right?
Okay. So the proposal does... Go ahead.
Sorry, is there a possibility of status and status message both being top-level properties as opposed to combined in a single struct or whatever? And if not, like, why wouldn't we do that?
That's a good question too.
It's I'm seeing that the code and the description is something related to each other. It has to be combined together. Why we need to split it?
Well, if you split it, you could get rid of the activity status entirely.
Yeah, that's one argument. The other argument is you don't have two ways to compare it. Like my concern is that people just compare the status directly, which if you ever change the message, you break code, right? Which I don't think is what we probably want.
Okay.
Right, because like given your API shape right now, it's very, you know, it makes sense to say activity.status double equals activity status dot error. Right, and now if you now fix a type on the error message, now we break everybody who relied on that to be true or false, right?
Yeah.
Which seems generally, I think, surprising to people. But I think if you combine them, I feel like you can't really not include the description in the comparison, because that's just violating anybody's assumption on how types compare, right?
Right.
In which case, you know, at the minimum, I would at least remove the fields to just make that harder to write in the first place. And then you're basically stuck with like that's the constructor, and then people have to dot into to get the code.
My only concern was that, I mean, like in the future, if there is something else we need to add there, I mean, related to the status, it will be ugly if we add like extra property on activity itself just to combine those. I mean, like if we have states like encapsulating the information here, it will give us the opportunity in the future to extend it.
Yeah, I buy
Are there
that
samples
argument.
somewhere for how we expect people to use this?
Yeah, I mean, just people, I mean, like, you know, while doing the operation, I mean, like, if they run into some error, I mean, they will create the status and set it to the to the activity at that time. And later, I mean, while collecting the information or listening to the activities and getting this information, it will get this stuff, and the consumers, it's up to the consumer what to do with that. I mean, like, should propagate this activity if there is error or not, or should get the description and add it to the logs, or whatever they want.
I guess I'm trying to understand. Like, I understand that at a high level, but when the rubber meets the road, like anytime I'm using an activity, I add a check against activity.status to see if somebody else previously in the line set it to something.
No.
So then who's actually accessing the status?
So the listener, like when you emit activity at the end of the activity, it will report if there's a listener, and the listeners will look at the finished activities and decide are they going to report the activity, or if they want to export the activity to some backend, they're going to leverage this field, convert that into the backend specific data.
Okay, and then so there's basically one place for any given activity where someone's extracting this data and doing something with it. What about the set side, the production side? Are there potentially multiple failures along the way, and what happens in that case?
Yeah, so my thinking is there are two scenarios. The main scenario would be people who instrument their code or instrument in the library. They decide, like, if they make HTTP request, and it's quite natural for them to decide, okay, for any HTTP like 4xx or like 5xx, they mark this as a error. And then on the listener side, people can correct this behavior. For example, if you have a logical operation from high level, like either storage blob, and you make multiple HTTP retries, you can tell in the processor, hey, for this thing, I'm going to ignore that because it's not an error in my perspective. I'm just doing long polling or something. So you can change that back to OK. Then from the consumption side, when people send that to the backend, they won't be able to get all the error like as noise.
So from your description, it sounds like you're actually expecting people to compare the status strings to determine whether the error is something they want to ignore or not.
No, it's not comparing the status. It's comparing the actual tags they associated with that activity. So for example, if you're making HTTP request, you check the HTTP response and decide whether it's an error or not. And by setting that
what I thought I heard you say, maybe I misheard. I thought I heard you say one component sets it to error to indicate they have an error, and then some other component says, you know what, I actually know how to handle that, and sets it back to OK. Is that not what you said?
Yes, it is. But instead of checking the status here, they check the other properties. Like from like either storage blob, you can imagine if they made multiple underlying HTTP requests and some of them failed, they could have a extra piece of logic like a listener and say for this underlying HTTP, they set status as error. But I think it's fine for all the operations that under this like URL, I'll just reset everything back to OK. In this way, they don't have to check they don't have to compare the status. They just, based on the other knowledge, they correct the information.
Okay. And they would also then, like if they were looking at baggage or tags, they would also clear out
Yeah.
the baggage and tags that influence their decision.
Yeah, yeah. Most likely they would look
we have APIs. We have APIs to clear baggage and tags.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I thought they were just enumerable returning properties.
No, if you remember, we had another APIs that we added. It's called set tags and set
Oh, right.
set baggage. Yeah,
Which end up removing if it's a null value or something.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And back to the question, like whether we can set that instead of having activity status as a struct, whether we can treat them two as separate fields on activity. I think from my perspective, it is doable, and this is what like we experiment in OpenTelemetry. It seems to be working to me. On one side, I see a potential issue. Just want to get people's idea. So if someone is trying to set the status code as like onset, and then they set description to something, we don't want to allow that situation. If it's onset, they shouldn't put any description. And by having a struct or object here, I can see a like very straightforward way to do that. But having two separate
How is that
fields,
different? Sorry, to interrupt. The scenario you just described where someone's looking at tags and baggage, doesn't that mean there's a bunch of things on the activity, not just the description, that are related to the error? So if they're having to reset some things, why wouldn't they just, why is it not okay for them to just have to know, to change everything that's relevant?
So from my perspective, like the status and description and the status code has a tight relationship. If you look at the state machine, it won't make sense if you have status onset where you have description. I don't see similar restriction on other tags.
I guess I'm having trouble understanding, I think, at a high level, why description isn't just any other tag.
Because we have a standard way that everybody can agree on how they can set this description errors in general. So if you have it in tag, you have to agree about like what is the key name at that time, and everybody should agree with that.
And there are no other tags that are predefined?
We have to standardize. I mean, like at the end, I mean, like we have to define what is the semantics at that time, what is the name of the key. I mean, what is the, so it's possible, but it will not be. I mean, like we have to make sure that everybody understand. Like if you have this key name in the tags, this means that this is a error description, which is.
I understand that. I'm just trying to understand. Like, do we do that already for other tags or other baggage that say this is a known key, this is a predefined key?
So for tags, it's more like a semantic convention, and people could mess that up. Like if someone is trying to set tag where it's supposed to be an integer, the API wouldn't stop them from setting that as a string or like a Boolean value. Having this one will give you better, like I guess better developer experience. It gives you strong type.
Yeah.
I mean, so my other question is, so like I'm not opposed to the enum, right? It's just it just seems weird to have two ways to compare it, right? If we just remove the unset OK and error fields from activity status, I think that's halfway there. I mean, I kind of agree with Stephen that it seems a bit weird to have these things together when you really expect people to check them individually. But I understand the concern with they're strongly typed and they're strongly tied, and there's a relationship between them that would now allow for impossible states on activity. My other question was like, do you want to have some sort of method on activity status similar to what we have on HTTP status, where you can say, ensure success or whatever, and they will basically just check whether the thing is okay and otherwise throw or something? Because I mean, if you ever extend the set here from okay error to like, I don't know, warning or something else, then people's code will have to change much more, because you're effectively encouraging people to write if statements with hard equality or switch statements, right? Which is generally harder to evolve if you want to have that.
Mm-hmm. It's very unlikely. I even suspect that probably we don't even have to expose the onset to the setter. Like people can only set things to error and OK. And I think it's nearly impossible that the open telemetry spec will later add another status here.
Well, would it then make sense to remove the enum and just have a bool?
So
I would have concern about that because I'm not sure about in the future if we got another case that we need to add to this status code. Maybe something else. I mean, like something between OK and error or something. I don't know.
I mean, looking at the
I mean, it would be
spec.
I mean, it would be very straightforward to evolve, right? I mean, today you would have a constructor that takes bool and description, and if you ever need a third state, what you would do is you would add another overload to the constructor that takes that new enum and description, and then you would just change the implementation of the property that returns the boolean to just compare to whatever values you see fit.
Yeah, I mean, the spec says that the description actually must only be used with the error status code value. So what we really have is the unset, OK, and error code, and then if error, then maybe a description.
Interesting. I mean, that kind of also begs the question, like, when will we ever see unset? Like, how do people ever get to unset in the first place?
By default, it's onset, and you can never set something to onset explicitly.
Yeah, this is a default value. If nobody cares about the status, don't touch it, so it will be unset.
Semantically, what's the difference between unset and OK? Like, when would someone make that distinction?
This is related to the open telemetry spec, so I can explain here. So the idea is, for instrumentation library like HTTP, you don't know whether when HTTP error happened, you don't know from the consumer side whether they think it's OK or not. So your best bet is either you just do nothing, you leave that as onset, or you tell people from HTTP perspective, I think it's an error. And then from your upper level, they might decide, okay, from my side, I think I don't care. I want to set this back to OK. But there's no scenario where people set OK to onset or error to onset or OK to error. So you can only set something from onset to error, and then someone can set that status from error to OK.
That all makes sense. I'm wondering what's the scenario where someone has a switch statement on the status and does something different from unset than they do for OK.
Right.
In a website tracing logs, it would say not specified would be the, because really it's just that you created one of these activities and then you never gave it a value. So if we believed it was really a boolean that would never expand, it's just nullable boolean, which is the caller didn't tell me if they succeeded or failed. Go figure it out from some of the inner messages.
Yeah, for Steven's question also about like I can have this switch statement to check about like I can set the status code if it is unset before. So I can know that if I have unset, I can set it. But if I have OK, I wouldn't do it. So this can make distinction also.
The activities are really never expected to be passed between methods, right? It's like you basically put a using activity, right, and then if you call another method and they want to trace something, they make a new activity which parents off of the current one.
Yeah, this is a usual pattern, yes.
Yeah, so there's never really an inspect or a mutate. It's this method owns this definition of an activity, and it sets the properties at once, and there should have never been a second writer.
But in the listener, you can do that. Like the activity listener can have the power to do that, and they can manipulate the finished activities.
Sure.
Also we have activity.current, which is stored as async local, which is like anybody in the stack can request this object and do something with it.
Fair enough. But just that the general expectation is that you wouldn't grab current and set its status to error. That you may add something to one of the bags to give context to an activity, but you wouldn't have been like, ooh, and I know now that it failed. Like, that should be the person who created its job. Granted, it's code, so anyone can do whatever they want, but
I agree.
yeah, I mean, I would probably flatten it and just on activity put status code and status description. And who cares if someone sets it to an invalid state? That's the listener's job when they write it down.
And if someone set the code to unset, we'll just take it, right? We're not going to ignore that or throw exception to them.
Yeah, throwing if they give you the value, -1 or 3, those both make sense. But unset's defined. Maybe they have a reason that they're trying to cancel where they had already set it to OK.
And is there like a common practice in .NET where you have two properties and they share some internal state? So if you set one thing to onset and then you try to set description, then something would happen differently.
We have a guideline that says don't do that.
Yeah, so this way we will allow people to set something as onset with a description.
Yeah, and then it'd be up to a listener to be that when they're sending it to the next level that they correct the bad state or whatever. Like, if it's the guidelines are if it's a property, you shouldn't have property to property relationship because people could have set them in an order other than you expect.
Yeah.
The only time that you can know that the object is done is when it gets to the listener, and then they now have to deal with this being in an invalid state. You could have the set status method, which you could then throw if they give a description and the type isn't error, which I think was one of the proposals. But
what about we keep the activity status struct as it is, but instead of have like description, we will have something called like error description. And you can set this only, like if you have error. So,
that just, again, that's assuming that the next update to the spec doesn't add a third code that says description makes sense for error and potato famine.
At that time we can add extra property or something.
One thing you could do is you could just remove the constructor, make the constructor private, and then just have two factory methods. One is called OK that takes no arguments. One is called error that takes an optional description. And then it's very clear that if you ever need OK with description, you just add an overload to it, so it would make it a field, so you can actually overload, and then just leave unset as the property that you have right now, read-only property. And then you could do that, and then this I think will discourage people from writing code like activity.status double equals activity status dot something, because OK and error are both methods now, so they're very unlikely to pick that as a comparison. I guess that's the best you could do. And then if the spec ever changes, you just add more methods to it.
I would just do a status and a status description, read-only properties and a status method, and now you can validate they only gave a description when it's error.
Yeah, that's certainly the easiest one.
It gets rid of the struct, it gets rid of the weird equality, it gets rid of needing a factory method on error. Like, this feels much cleaner and looks a little bit closer to the spec. Unless it's supposed to be .status code and .status.description, but
right. To Riley's earlier point, normally the pattern when we have properties of interdependencies is that usually the as Jeremy said, the configuration can happen in any order, and then at some point you call a method that does something, and then the method is usually responsible for validating that the current snapshot of the properties in its entirety makes sense. And if they don't, you throw an exception like invalid operation or whatever is appropriate, and you tell the developer what they messed up, right? And that's usually how we deal with that, because the type system isn't expressive enough. And so in this case, I think it would be probably whatever endpoint you have that consumes the activities, because there really isn't any method on activity you would call, right? Which in fairness might be late in the game. So maybe you just ignore it rather than throwing.
Okay. Okay. So you prefer this more than the factory methods you mentioned?
This just like the activity status type, unless you think it has value because the spec calls it a status struct or something. But to me, it really just feels like it's two properties on activity. You kind of care that the status description is null unless the status code is error. Is null if the status code is not error.
Right.
And that having two properties and one method to set the two of them together seems to make the most sense. Like, that just feels cleaner. It gets rid of an extra type. It gets rid of the question of what does equals equals mean when there's a description. It just solves a lot of problems.
Yeah, it doesn't strike me as something you would pass around in isolation. Like, I mean, why would you ever care about only the status? Like, most likely you care about the entire activity, right? So it's not one of those things where, you know, having a convenient value representing both at the same time is super useful.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, the only thing, as I mentioned, about in the future, about if for any reason, I mean, like OpenTelemetry decided to add, like, you know, like there is generic status code, but there is more specific code. I mean, like, you know, yeah, it's okay, but the specific code will be something else. For example,
I mean, one thing we could be doing is, like, I would be okay with saying, you know, take activity status, right? Keep it a read-only struct, remove the description from it, and basically just make it a strongly typed enum around an int, right? Similar, basically, so that you can actually add new members to it, right? So we could do that, right? Basically having a manual enum, if you will. And so if you ever add another field to it, we can, right? That wouldn't be terrible. But I think that I mean, that's kind of on you and like how likely you think that is, because it is a fairly heavyweight thing, but probably it wouldn't be terrible because user experience is almost indistinguishable whether it's an enum or, you know, a hand rolled struct. But to me, it's really the important part is, as Jeremy said, is like, it seems that the message is not something you generally care about in comparisons. So if you expect anybody to switch over it, the only thing I would put on there are things that you expect people to write code for. So there's a subcategory or, you know, a subcode or whatever. Sure, that seems fine to add because you would expect people to handle that. But I would really avoid this, you know, display purpose stringy things coinciding with things that you think are important for checking.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm okay with what proposed here. Riley, what do you think about this proposal?
I'm fine with that. I think one thing is like as long as we make sure the user from the public API, they cannot set the status to like onset, and they cannot set a description for OK, then it should be fine.
Yeah, I mean, status method should handle this.
Yeah,
this mechanism.
So that looks good to me. I think it's very unlikely that OpenTelemetry later will enrich the status to have more stuff, because initially it started with a lot of stuff and people decided it's not going to work for everyone, and they take the very conservative approach. So I hope we'll be done with that.
Okay, I'm fine with this proposal then.
May I ask just one quick question? Just out of curiosity, instead of why is a property more interesting than like a try get function? For not for the status. The status makes sense. It's the description. Just out of curiosity, like, is a property important here as opposed to a try get, and if it's false, there's no description?
That just feels weird.
I mean, I'm not entirely
Is
sure
it? Oh, okay.
For me.
What you are asking, like, what do you mean by try get? Like, you would basically say try get.
So right now it's a nullable string.
Right.
Right. So instead of a nullable string property, it is a bool try get description, and
I
it
see.
always returns, and it's like this is the status description.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing logically wrong with it. It just, as Jeremy said, it's just, I mean, normally try something for an operation that might not work, right? It's usually not for, do you have that piece of data? Like it's usually like, I mean, dictionaries are kind of weird because null is usually, for values, legal, so it's hard to distinguish these two. But normally you would just say the absence of a value is expressed by the value being null. That seems a more intuitive way to model that.
Okay.
Yeah, this is not an exact science.
Yeah.
This
In this case, a null description would only mean a lack of description, as opposed to, again, a dictionary value where null could be the value you were storing. So it's not an ambiguous null.
Okay.
I realize the problem with you running the meeting but me streaming emo is we don't get the preview of the message.
Yeah, I can just post it. I mean, we will approve the API, so make an executive decision of already mark it as approved. And now we can just, let me just post what I have in my notes. And then everybody can read it, and then I edit it from there.
Excellent.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
All right.
Did you want the set status description to be defaulted to null?
Right, yeah. This was in the proposal, actually, in the notepad.
Oh, okay, that's good. Yeah. Well, I just typed it from my phone, so I didn't quite see what Jeremy was saying there. Okay, cool.
Right.
Sweet. Then I think the next one is 28776, right? The proposal and implementation for Link. Yep. Eric, are you on the call?
Yeah, I'm here. So this is basically continuing the conversation that we had about this proposal last week. Basically, we ended up approving the element.that method overloads, but we stopped short of the slicing operation for a couple of reasons. One was the choice of name. Namely, there were objections raised about the use of the name slice. And secondly, the semantics of the slicing operation, whether it should fail when the range is out of bounds, and whether it should be like a lazy operation. It was pointed out during the previous meeting that using the name take would probably solve much of this ambiguity, and basically I went through it and I'm kind of satisfied myself that take is the right name for this operation. So Imo, if you scroll down, you'll see the final form of the proposed APIs. So the idea is that you have the element.that methods that have been approved already, and then you have the take overload that accepts an enumerable and a range and returns an enumerable that matches the provided ranges. If the range is out of bounds, it will return an empty enumerable, so it has precisely the same semantics as take if, for example, your input integer is too big. I've kind of found that this actually is very useful. If you scroll down a bit more in the original post, there is a quote here where it lists all the possible ways you can use the new overload and which existing solutions it replaces. So I really think that this would be a very useful addition to our users. The implementation provided, I'm satisfied that the implementation as provided by the poster is the right one for us, and it has the precise semantics that I explained. So it's a lazy enumerable, and like I said, it returns elements that do not match the provided range are skipped completely. That's about it.
So Eric, I haven't looked at the implementation that's being proposed, but is it essentially like a switch statement or an if-else cascade that basically checks the input range at both ends of the index and returns .take, .skip, .take, .skip, etc. based on what the inputs were?
More or less. So basically, it checks whether the starting index and the ending index are from end, and it follows different approaches depending on their values. Obviously, things get more complex when you have from end indices in your range, and that has certain memory ramifications, but they're exactly the same as element that. So you would have potentially O of n memory usage if you're doing crazy stuff with from end.
But it's basically just deferring to the existing take and skips, especially in the case of the queryable.
In the case of the in the case of the prototype, no. So it's its own implementation. It's not deferring to take and skip, and this is primarily because these don't support from end operations, and also it wouldn't be as efficient because you would need to use multiple queues in each of the slices to store the intermediate elements as you try to calculate the end of the enumerable, if that makes sense.
Fair enough.
So basically, the only difference to the notes we talked last time is you basically convinced yourself that take is the correct name, right? Nothing else has changed.
Yeah, it really eliminates the ambiguity in terms of how should this behave. It should behave exactly the same way as the existing take, but now it kind of replaces, skip last, and take last in one go, and I'm really happy with that.
Cool. Any concerns from anybody or questions?
You said. All right, so we feel that queryable can do this without being a pit of failure, and I think you said we're not doing it for Plink, and just making sure that those are the correct states, and that we're happy with that state.
Yeah, so obviously we do not expect query providers to fully support take the queryable take, but just implementing it is the preferable approach comparing to people accidentally defaulting back to the enumerable implementation. So I would expect that somebody like a query provider might choose to implement like regular ranges, but throw if a from end range is provided.
Fair enough.
So does it? So like I'm still not 100% sure what you said. So is it basically like a query provider? There will be a default implementation of the take with the range that will do something, but a query provider can also choose to special case it and do something custom. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And out of curiosity, why not Plink? Does it not define take?
We had a conversation of which the details I can't recall at the moment, but it's in the thread. We kind of decided to not explore that option for the moment.
Fair enough.
If we wanted to do plink, it's such a complicated body of code. I think the right answer would be to implement take last and skip last, because I don't think we added those. And then this one would just delegate to the existing methods.
Yeah, I was about to say, and Steve, how does that make you feel? And you seem to be like, it's fine, don't do it. So
I would only do it if we actually find a strong reason to.
Okay.
For the most part, for the 99% case of plink is, where select order by, or some subset of that. And definitely I wouldn't do this until we did or added the other operations that we haven't yet added, like take last.
All right.
Makes sense.
All sounds good to me then. I think that was all the outstanding concerns we had from last time.
All right, so then I'll post my comment and I just marked it as approved.
Cool. Thank you.
I think then the next one is, I think Carlos's analyzer, right?
Correct. So this analyzer already exists in the VS Threading repo, which has some existing analyzers, but it never got turned on. It seems that it's pretty stable. So this is a first-party request, and since it has already been developed and is stable, if we agree on bringing it or turning it on, Rosling analyzers. So what we want to do is move the code from that repo to Rosling analyzers and test it in the runtime repo to see how noisy it is, because that was one of the concerns. And depending on how noisy it is, we want to decide what the category would be, or the severity, I mean. So what this analyzer does is it would find any method invocations inside an async method and see if they have an overload that is asynchronous and suggest changing the method into that overload. If the same arguments can be applied, basically.
So I can tell you right now, it is going to be noisy. Right? That's just going to happen.
Yeah, this is going to hit JSON.NET all over the place, for instance, because JSON.NET has JSON serializer.deserialize async of string methods, whose implementation is literally thread pool.queuser work item deserialize and then wait on the result and return it.
There are patterns throughout the code base where we have a single code path that passes along a Boolean flag as to whether it's actually sync or async, and then in the leaf node it says if async, await, foo async, else foo. So it'll flag, all those cases. There are places where, for whatever reason, we're already sure that the thing has completed, and we use either .results or getAwait or .getResult to propagate exceptions. All of those get flagged.
Okay.
So
we can still
then
bring it to our repo and enable it, but mark it as hidden to avoid making it noisy, and only those who specifically want to apply it will turn it on in their project.
Yeah, I think I have no problem with, in general, enabling this in an analyzer. I think what it comes down to will be some fiddling in the analyzer itself to kind of strike the right balance when it is enabled. Choosing the right default setting in general, which is probably info, and then choosing what to do in our own repos. But I suspect, as written, we're not just going to want to ship it. I suspect we're going to want to tweak it a little bit.
Yeah, I was about to say, it seems like I'm hesitant to approve it as is. I would just say, put it to the runtime repo and tell us what you found, basically. I think that would be the input to the decision whether we think it's a good candidate to ship or not.
Okay, but if
this
it's
is
requested
not
by a first-party team and they want it to be enabled so they can consume it, but we don't want it to be noisy in our repo, can't we approve it as hidden?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any problem with taking a thing out of VS analyzers and moving it into the Roslyn analyzer's default package if it's with a default of off, and that maybe we can decide later that it can be a default of higher than off. But
right.
Yeah, personally, I don't see a problem with let's just move this into a different DLL. And then the rest of it of, hey, we want to change it to, we want to add the following concepts to it, and then we think we can turn it on by default at this severity, would be a different discussion.
I guess it boils down to what you think the approval is for, right? To me, it seems it's kind of like saying, let's approve an API and then let's discuss the shape of the API later. It seems like we want to approve effectively what we think the right severity is, right, in one place. I mean, I think the analyzer, to me, it makes sense to have, right? I mean, I'm not objected to that. It just seems like if we want to decide, discuss on by default, off by default severity, then you kind of want to have the data to make the determination. And while the runtime repo isn't entirely representative of customer code, it's probably a good indicator for what are the corner cases we should consider, right?
Definitely corner cases, but we also do a lot of things that we don't expect anyone else to do.
Right. Or a few people, let's say. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so would it be fine to bring it to the Rosling analyzer repo as hidden, and then we can continue this conversation to decide what the severity would be if we want to approve it for the runtime repo?
Yeah, like I would not. I mean, I think so. So I guess my commitment would be we will approve it. I think we just want to have a conversation on severity and on by default status, right? So I think moving the DLL is.
Also, I just want to point out, in case it was missed, Carlos, like you can run the existing analyzer over the .NET Runtime repo. It doesn't need to be in ROS and analyzers to get a read for what happens.
Also true. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That's good to know.
Fair enough. And yeah, that's a good. So then, being able to identify, here are some classes of problem that we think that we should improve before turning it on would maybe be good. So.
Okay.
But yeah, my general feeling is, yeah, obviously VS has done this. I think ReSharper has done this. I don't know how they are on their edge cases. It seems like a reasonable analyzer to have, but the devil's in the details of, is it providing value or is it something someone's going to shut off because it's too noisy? But I think it's worth a code. Just, can we get it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'll mark it as needs work. No, that was the wrong clipboard contents. I guess this wasn't entirely wrong. It was just too much code. Here we go. So I guess the action item is just run it over the repo, walk over the results, and then see what do you think is a reasonable proposal for severity.
Okay, sounds good.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right, I think this might be Aaron. Or Eleanor, I think this is Eleanor's, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is basically exposing a way for a third party like a source generator that we're adding for pinvokes to handle propagating the last error from a pinvoke. Mm-hmm. So right now, in the built-in runtime, the user can specify that last error in a pinvoke, and the runtime itself does kind of three main things. It'll reset the system error, which for us is error no or last error, get the system error, and then cache it so that it can be retrieved through one of the Marshall APIs. So this proposal is basically exposing three methods that map to those three things so that a third party could perform those actions. Yeah, so the first two are basically getting and setting the system error, and then the set last win32 error is really setting the last platform invoke error. Its naming matches the get last win32 error, which is admittedly not an ideal name.
So get last win32 error is only getting the last one trapped by a pinvoke. It doesn't actually call get last error?
Yes. It is getting the last one trapped by a pinvoke.
Things I never knew.
Just to be clear, nobody knows. Just I can't stress enough that the amount of insight that Eleanor gave in this call was very unfortunate, because I didn't know this either. Like, there's a bunch of weirdness in this area.
Yeah, I totally thought get last win32 error was just straight up GLE.
Nope.
Okay, so get last system error will be just a straight call to get last error, Windows-centric view of the world. And set last error will set it such that if you then jump to native code and call to get last error, you will see that same code.
Yes.
Okay.
It also allows us to basically clear the last error by setting it to 0.
Right.
So
I mean, I hate the names, but apparently it's consistent, so...
yeah, it's like the other option is to just add a new pair that's like set and get last pinvoke instead of the win32. And then we have the weird get last win32 error that basically does the same thing as the new get last pinvoke.
I mean, actually, naming a new method pair and then obsoleting getLastWin32 error as, if you want the behavior, call the pinvoke one, and if you want the concept, call the system one, might be reasonable.
I was about to say the same thing. I mean, especially because you have this nuance now that you want to communicate as well, it might make sense to just completely kill the old method.
Sure.
While we edit, also fix the naming.
Yeah, I think I have the it listed as alternate designs for adding a new pair. I'm not sure if last pinvoke error makes sense, but the rest of the
Yeah, I mean, I think we're not committed on that name either. Like, if you have a better suggestion, that's also fine. It was just, I think, what we just came up with.
Do we use the word pinvoke anywhere? Like, the attribute's called DLL import. The concept is certainly called pinvoke. Just, do we use that in API anywhere?
I mean, like, frankly, like, set last DLL import error is also not a terrible name, right? At least it's platform neutral. But I think pinvoke is also fine. I believe we use it in some APIs. Let me check, but I thought we did.
We do, yeah. There is a pinvoke Marshall class.
Yeah. Yeah, I think using pinvoke is fine. I think we have used it so much publicly that it's...
That's fine. Like,
I
know that it's a concept that people understand.
Yeah.
Or think they understand. But the... I just wanted to make sure we weren't introducing the words for the first time when we've been using other words elsewhere. But if we've already used it, then that's my concern.
So then, okay.
Yeah, so I think an important part of this would be also to mark the existing getLastWin32 error as obsolete.
So, okay, so then, let me get this right, pinvoke error. So we're adding 4 methods: getLastSystem error, setLastSystem error, getLastPinvoke error, setLastPinvoke error, and then the obsolete getLastWin32 error with use getLastSystem error or getLastPinvoke error. Question, I guess, now is, do we bother with a diagnostic code?
I would, because if somebody's cross-compiling, they'll need to call the method that still existed in NetStandard 2.0, and that'll give them just a, like, yes, I'm aware I'm cross-compiling, just stop telling me about this.
That seems fine. Does anybody know what the next ID happens to be?
We are, in theory, keeping track of all of these.
Yeah.
I don't know, when we did some approved some crypto things last week, I just wrote down next ID when we approved them to the implementation to grab a slot off the table.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that seems fine. I can write that down. While I'm at it, I will also add URL format with and call it the proper URL. Okay, so that seems fine then. I mean, that might be noisy, because I think lots of people are using getLastWin32 error, but
yeah, but how many of them? For many people, it's probably doing what they want, but for some of them, it's not. And we could write an analyzer to do we could write an analyzer replacer to just let you say replace all. And maybe that's what we want instead of obsolete as an analyzer. But obsolete feels good to me.
Yeah, I mean, unless there's some complicated logic that it would be worth guarding, but I don't think there will be. So my understanding is now, based on what I heard, is that get last system error is basically literally calling the OS API, like last Win32 error or whatever, and then get last pinvoke error is just the last one that we happen to trap. Is that correct?
Yeah. And trapping is an explicit action on the pinvoke, so you have to say, I want to trap there for this pinvoke.
Right. Yeah, I think that conceptual difference to me makes it worthwhile to obsolete. Probably not for existing code, but probably for anybody who's writing new code. So I think the fact that we can also fix the naming, I think, is just sugar on top of that. But I think it's actually good that we can actually also rename it to make it very clear that there's a conceptual path break now that you have to consider.
Yeah, I think an analyzer as a replacement rule, unless, I mean, I guess the replacement rule is easy. You find all calls to, it's just a text replacement, marshal.setLast Win32 error to get last to marshal.getLast pinvoke error, and now all your warnings go away. So,
right,
whichever.
So I posted the comment. It would be good if you could get the read.
Presumably you want to use get last system error or get last pinvoke error, not get last system error or set last pinvoke error. But strings are fungible.
Yes. Yep. Okay, fix that.
Looks good to me.
Sweet. Then let's move on to the next one. I think it's Eric again.
Yay! So again, this is a link community request. It basically concerns, whenever you want to, for example, copy an IEnumerable into a buffer, occasionally you want to make sure that if you can somehow tell the size of the IEnumerable without enumerating through the entire thing. So in many cases, you have users that would typically just do ad hoc type tests, testing all your I collections and I read-only collections and what have you, potentially missing out on stuff. So I presume that the motivation for this proposal is that we want an authoritative method that, does all the type tests and always make sure that we can somehow obtain a count for the supplied IEnumerable without ever performing an actual enumeration. Because of the nature of the method, it is actually defined as a static method rather than an extension method, and it has this peculiar name. So you would have to call it using enumerable.try get non-enumerable count, non-enumerated count. It would return true if the count could somehow be obtained via type tests, and return false if we cannot do
that. Why do you think it can't be an extension method?
Because it subscribes to the try get pattern, so I didn't feel that it would necessarily be appropriate to chain it with a sequence of other link methods.
Yeah, best you could do is maybe return a nullable event, but that's a pattern we don't really follow a lot in the framework.
I mean, you can have, try get value on an interface. There's no reason you can't have a try as an extension unless the language prohibits outs on extension methods.
I don't think it does.
It doesn't chain, but
yeah, I was about to say, I think chaining clearly doesn't apply here, but I think readability-wise, enumerable, dot try get enumerated count of source comma out var count seems much more ugly than saying source dot try get enumerated count out var count, right? It just seems like you're asking the person to type in more character for close to zero gains. To me, it seems natural to have it as an extension method because, as Jeremy said, it's logically part of the interface, right?
It definitely doesn't change how you would consume it. I guess it's more about pointing out that this is a sort of special method that you only use when you deal with allocating buffers and stuff. But
Right.
maybe it's not important.
But not all of the extension methods provided by the enumerable class are chainable because count returns an int. You're not gonna stay in enumerable land after that one. So yeah,
Sure.
I think it is a reasonable extension method because it is like all the other things on enumerable.
I mean, the added benefit is discoverability, right?
Yeah, and basically I assume it will be take all of the special cases that are currently at the beginning of the implementation of the count method, move that to this method, and then have count defer to that, so we only have the one list.
Yeah. I mean, I really like the method. I think I proposed it 8 years ago or something. No, before I joined Microsoft, so 12 years ago or something. And of course, Matt's closed it. So, I think it's a good idea.
Is there any dissent?
Silence is approval.
Just to confirm, the implementation of this would probably try casting to something like iCollection or iRead-only collection. And I know that the count property is a property, but do we guarantee that it's O of 1?
I mean, sane implementations of iCollection should guarantee that, but
Nothing says they have to.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we make the claim that, like you said, a sane implementation would have that behavior, then we would just rely on that, right?
Yep.
I mean, I would say if you implement a property getter as an ON implement, like an ON semantic, then it's on you. Like
we've done that in quite a few places in the runtime.
No, I know, but like I think that's the best you can do, right? I mean, we can't look into the code and determine whether it's ON, right?
We can't. The reason that I was kind of going on this is I'm checking MSDN, and MSDN doesn't say that it's O of 1. So I'm trying to figure out if realistically there might be a significant number of iCollection derived types that do this as an O of N operation.
I mean, for all the optimizations that we apply in Link, like this assumption is more or less hard-baked, and I think most libraries do the same thing. So
yeah, I mean, in fact, like we ask people, don't take a collection, right? Take an enumerable and then try to get the count via the casting, right? And we never provided a method to do it, so I think it seems reasonable. But strictly speaking, casting interface is also not an O1 operation, right? Because you have to potentially find multiple interfaces and like jump to the correct method. So it's interface dispatch, so it's already not the fastest in the universe. But
interface dispatch is O of constant because types don't randomly get interfaces at runtime.
Ah, look at my ref and mid type here.
Yeah.
No, but like I think it's.
Yeah. Okay. No. Okay. If we already make that assumption elsewhere in Link, then we're good.
I'd also expect that most people who are implementing iCollection aren't implementing iCollection. They're just wrapping a list of T underneath the covers, just like WinForms does and most of the rest of the BCL does when they want to expose a new collection type.
Yeah, that's probably also true. All right, so then let's move to the next one then. That would be also Eric, I think.
Hey. Okay, so yet another community API proposal. In this case, it basically concerns implementing a chunking method, especially if you want to do a bit of parallelism. I found this is like a particularly useful method to include. People have pointed out that you could perhaps achieve the same thing by group by, but I think just returning arrays of stuff might have been more useful. The signature basically accepts an enumerable and a maximum size per chunk, and it does what you would expect.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Is there any reason why I guess we return enumerable because we actually stream Yeah, fair enough. Yep.
Is chunk
Seems
by
reasonable.
the name that you expect people to look for, as opposed to like, I don't know,
So
two-chunked array? Or
there have been debates in this issue. If you scroll down a bit, I think one misgiving I have with the by suffix is that it might imply, some kind of selector function as an argument. So perhaps just calling it chunk or batch or what have you might be preferable. I'm actually checking to see what Rx is using for the same thing at the moment. Rx calls it, no, sorry.
I mean, I kind of agree with Jeremy. On the other hand, like normally we refer to this as chunking, right? But I don't think I would have looked for chunk. I don't know why.
I think I would have looked for two something.
yeah, because it feels like it's a variant of two-array, of two bounded arrays, or something.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Or two-chunked arrays, or.
So the only reason why, I mean, I kind of agree with their proposal. At the same time, though, like 2 seems wrong if the operation itself streams. You know what I mean? Like 2 kind of implies that you return everything at one shot, kind of. Which this wouldn't do, right? It would still give you one array at a time. I mean, I think other terms they use is partitioning, but I also don't think that's exactly what you want, because that even more implies some sort of selector function, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I can't think of a better term than chunk. But the by is weird. I mean, why wouldn't we just call it chunk? Would that be weird?
I think chunk is fine.
Yeah, I think I agree with the comment of, the bys all have a selector function. So if we're going with chunk as the verb, then I think it would just be chunk.
I didn't see this comment in the, or I didn't see this in the comments, but IEnumerable of T array as opposed to IEnumerable of IEnumerable of T.
Sorry?
IEnumerable of T array as opposed to IEnumerable of T.
I would say that given that you're looking to chunk things into like definitely sized items, I think something that is more of a I read only list would be preferable. But I think array is good enough for most intents and purposes. I don't know how others feel.
Yeah, I mean, it seems almost artificial to create an interface here, because fundamentally we would probably give it out an array instance anyway. Like, what else would we do?
Yeah, and this is just more honest.
At that point, yeah.
Okay.
At that point, you might as well just return the array.
So
It's also slightly shorter.
Normally, when we return concrete types like arrays or lists, the method name has array, list, or similar in there, because we say as part of the contract, we are giving you an array, like you can rely on this.
And we could call it chunk to arrays, but
or two chunked arrays or something like that. But yeah or two array chunks.
It would also mean we could overload in the future, because if we just call it chunk by returning T array, we can't.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, the Rx equivalent is called buffer. I can confirm. Obviously, observables have different nuances, but that's the terminology that they use.
So, just a comment here, kind of going on what Levi said about IEnumerable of IEnumerable. if we did that, we could actually make this more efficient by saying we're returning an IEnumerable, the user shouldn't cache it, and therefore they can't rely on like the underlying array being not reused or things like that, right? Because if we're doing T array here, then we can't actually return a struct enumerator or anything else. We actually have to allocate every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
That's true.
But this is on, system link enumerable, which means mostly it's about people writing smaller code instead of writing better code.
Right, but if we did an IEnumerable of IEnumerable, then they still have the option of for each, and then with it doing X2 array if they actually need to save it.
Maybe, but I think that the immediate question they would have is, or immediate response is, but I want to know how long it is, which means now they want an IEnumerable of iCollection, at which point we would just say, fine, here's your array.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's also only efficient if you disallow enumerating any given stub enumerable more than once, which seems weird.
Yeah. I mean, you could complexly, if you were doing IEnumerable of iList, and say that the value is not guaranteed after you call move next, is you just use the same iList and call clear each time. And you just return the same thing from current every time. But that would be...
that would be mean.
Sneaky.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, it's also, like, consider people use this thing, right? They will, I mean, as Jeremy said, when people want to write compact code, right, they will probably also just do a 2-array at the end. I don't think most people even care about the streaming of this API in the first place, right? So I'd be shocked if that would ever allow us to write something that is substantially more efficient for most call sides. Like, I mean, if you really care about efficiency, I mean, a for loop is your friend, right? Like, this is not hard code here.
Right.
Yeah, so in one of the comments that I left in chat is that, like all link extension methods, this ends up on string as well. If you call string.chunkby and just get a bunch of char arrays back, you're going to be in for a bad time if you try to operate on them. Because you're going to have split the string in arbitrarily different ways. Like, you can't do anything useful with them. Like, you can't do case conversion on them independently. You can't do any type of like transcoding on them independently, and so on. You basically have to treat it as opaque data at that point. Again, that's just by virtue of it being a link method. I'm just trying not to lead people down a path where they could get into problems.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. On the other hand, like, as you said, like, that's, I mean, we tried to fix this in .NET Core v1 by making string not implement IEnumerable of T in the first place, but that had other problems. So I don't know. At this point, given that IntelliSense has a way to hide extension methods, which I think anybody who's ever used thing kind of, on string gets used to it, to turn it off and then try to see what's actually on string, right?
I mean, one could, like, if the argument is called max size, one could say that we're at a string and you passed 5, but it sees that between 5 and 6 is a surrogate split, that the first one returns 4, and then the second one returns starting at 5. Like, if it says max, there's no we don't have to guarantee that it's square until the last element.
I think that would confuse people, though, because I think people would rely on the behavior that every element except the very last one has the max size.
Probably. If strings were the only thing that was weird, then you turn them from being broken in one way to broken in another, and makes them pay attention.
Yeah, I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it. I'm just saying, like, we should consider ways to have people avoid that pitfall, like whether it's an analyzer or something else.
Yeah. String has to char array. If we called this, the more wordy 2 chunked arrays, then it's sitting there with the same, like, you're doing a 2 in an array, and you're supposed to know what you're doing at that point.
Yeah.
So, are you saying 2 chunked arrays? That's the proposal? 2 chunked arrays?
Yeah.
The to prefix very strongly implies O event memory usage as well, which is correct here.
It also implies eager evaluation of the IEnumerable, which we don't have in this case.
That is correct, yes.
I mean, we could make it T array.
I mean, I'm not opposed to two-chunked array. I mean, like it has a nice two-chunked arrays because it has the benefit if you actually search for two array. I think it will also show this in IntelliSense, I believe. And so it seems beneficial. I mean, the 2-1 is a bit weird, as I said earlier, because it kind of implies we don't stream, we just consume everything, which we don't. But I mean, we certainly consume intermittently, right? So it's not like we're not eagerly consuming the IEnumerable, right?
I think if we called it two-chunk array, then the return type should be TRA array, but that eliminates certain use cases where you only want to take, the first 3 chunks or whatever.
Right.
So we're killing off a bit of usability in that case.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. I mean, maybe we can also just call it chunk arrays because, I mean, at least then you have.
I mean, effectively, it's a transformation like select. So.
Sorry, I joined late, so I apologize. But since we're talking about arrays, did we already discuss why this isn't an IEnumerable of T rather than IEnumerable of T array?
Yes, the idea was that it seems unlikely that we will have a better implementation than just giving you straight an array.
Okay, just to Levi's comment about order and memory, it would be up to the developer.
What developer?
Yeah, I mean, it's order max size, right?
So why wouldn't we be able to have a more efficient implementation with IEnumerable of IEnumerable? Because with IEnumerable of IEnumerable, you could hold the IEnumerable and have you could just hold the overall enumerable, its current position, and an integer tracking how many you've iterated so far.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. Like Levi commented that the current design requires order and memory, and I'm saying with IEnumerable of IEnumerable, you wouldn't.
Right.
That's fair. I guess the question is, what's the actual usable type here? Like.
Yeah, I mean, like, my feeling is if you do this, one of the things you're going to want to look at in the chunks is how long each chunk is. I could be wrong. I don't have a use for this, so I'm speculating. And once we have that, then now we want something richer than IEnumerable. And as we start to go richer, we're just ultimately being an array, and then we should just be honest and give them the array so they get array benefits.
I mean, anyone can get the array simply by doing .to array, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just more ugly.
Is it?
But that's always a copy, right?
7 more characters or something? I mean, what?
Even if it's already an array?
No, because the problem is, so let's say we return IEnumerable of T array, right? In that case, the only thing I have to do is call T array, call to array on the whole thing. And now I have an array of arrays, which is probably what most people want to work with, would be my guess. Because this is not an API that you use for high-performance scenarios. Right? You would just write your for loop by hand. And so I feel like if you now return IEnumerable of IEnumerable, well then it's not just me calling to array. Now I have to also do dot select and then x goes to x dot to array and then to array. So like it's a lot more characters than just
I mean,
putting
right.
to array somewhere.
But the other benefit of LINQ isn't just because you don't want to write performance code or you want to write simple code. It's also because you want to write lazy enumerated code. In which case, if we're returning an enumerable arrays, then we're not really being lazy. We're just partially lazy.
Well, you're partially lazy. I think given that you asked for max size, is it really that hard to? You still get laziness for the entire sequence, right? You don't get it for every single chunk, but that seems acceptable in my opinion.
I mean, as a concept question, and feel free to shoot me down on this, would it be better to have public static int take this IEnumerable of T source, comma, span of T, of I have a thing here, I want you to put as many as you can into it and tell me how many that was? I guess the problem is you want that on IEnumerator because you want it to maintain its position. All right.
It would be something like a copy to or populate or something like that.
Yeah, well, because I was looking for a while there's still data, give me the next 7, and I already have the buffer, just fill it. But I think that is hard to write with the state machines we have.
Yeah.
It's also span wouldn't be very
so
nice here because you probably want to have yield support in that method, and then it becomes all ugly.
Yeah, one of the comment from chat is why not an as instead of 2? So, as chunked arrays, unless we want to change the return type. As chunked arrays seems okay. It gives the I'm not completely detached, and the method itself was low cost. It's until you call move next that's when it becomes expensive.
Well, that's a bit of a.
Well, I'm just like, if you
Sneaky.
call that enumerable but never actually walk it, then it didn't do any work. So
the thing that I don't get about the enumerable of enumerable conversation is I asked for chunks. If I just wanted to lazy enumerate all of them, I would just lazy enumerate all of them. But I wanted it in chunks, right?
Yeah.
It's like there's a reason I want them in chunks, potentially to pass it into another method or.
You're getting them in chunks. You're just getting it in a lazy chunk.
Yeah.
It's just a different data type for it. It's still a chunk.
There's also the issue. By returning an IEnumerable, you're suggesting that the IEnumerable can be enumerated multiple times, or with the inner IEnumerable can be enumerated multiple times, which it's not obvious to me how you would support that without just allocating an array.
You reset the original enumerable.
Yeah, you would have to enumerate the whole thing again. Yeah.
Exactly. Which
but that
may
seems
be worse than just allocating the array.
I mean, I think in general you can't really rely on enumerables being enumerated multiple times without side effects, right? I mean, if somebody enumerates stuff from the file system and some one of the selectors or whatever happens to delete files or remove them or do something, then enumerating them again will lead to different outcomes, right? So, I mean, in practice, people usually bad things happen when you randomly enumerate random enumerables multiple times. Like, I would not rely on that.
Right,
anyway.
but that means that if we did this and someone does want to know the count, if we've implemented a efficient enumerable, I guess we could make it be something that that our count method detects as countable. But the problem would be now you have to call count. Well, that walked it, and now you walk it, and so now we are making it where if you care about the length, it is a double enumerate.
Well, it should only be a single enumerate in the case that the underlying collection is actually an iList of T.
Yeah.
Because you take the count of the total backing of source, and then you subtract the current index, and that lets you know how many you're going to enumerate in the sub-enumerable.
But yeah, I mean, I think there was a comment from YouTube chat of why can't we have both, and that's part of the reason we wanted to put arrays in it, is we could put as chunks, which is IEnumerable of IEnumerable and is more efficient, and as chunked arrays, which is probably what's going to get called more of the two.
I'd be fine with that.
I mean, personally, I would just do the arrays and then ask people to come back if they really, really need the lazy version of the chunk.
Yeah, I still don't see the lazy version. Like, why didn't I just enumerate the whole thing from the beginning? Like, what advantages is chunking it in lazy enumerable helping?
The same reason select or where exists. It's a 7-line helper to do something that you're trying to do, rather than having to maintain the count yourself and keep track of the 5 things that you wanted to process in a batch.
Yeah.
You call this method and it does it for you.
Basically, if you're calling some other backend batch API that has a limit of 5 per call, then for each.
But it takes an IEnumerable though.
I'm just like that. While building that request, you could be like, for each in chunks of 10, go build the request and now send it. But
yeah, like if you wanted to create multiple lists that were each no bigger than 32 elements due to a performance optimization on your backend, then you might want to say chunk by 32 and create lists from those IEnumerables of 32.
But there you just keep a counter.
Yeah, probably.
That's what
I
I'm
mean,
saying.
it's not hard.
This is all just a helper, right?
Yeah, that's all link really is in general. I mean, you really don't want to use link for a lot of cases, and it's often not that much more trivial than a for each loop.
Yeah, which is why Steve recently went through and removed all of our uses from it in the runtime repo. It's not hard, but it caused a library to be linked in.
But at least if I get something back with a count and an indexer, I don't know. That feels more useful to me.
Right. Yeah, my gut says the people who are calling this don't care about performance, and that the IEnumerable of TArray is more what they want. But if there are people who are concerned about the performance, then I think the answer is the thing that dissatisfies everyone, which is add both of them.
It's hard for me to know because there's no use cases shown in this issue.
There are some links to some Stack Overflow questions in the issue. It looks like around half of the respondents returned IEnumerable of T, but to be honest, like I don't know how useful those answers were to the original posters. It looks like pagination was actually the big scenario.
I don't know why you wouldn't do pagination with like skip and take.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
Well, if you're doing it with repeated calls to skip and take, and you have a non-indexed underlying structure, then that is in squared work.
Yeah.
Yeah, but usually pagination usually means like give me page 3, right? You're not like, if you're enumerating everything, you just enumerate everything.
Fair enough.
As opposed to saying like I literally want just what's on page 3. So, skip 20, take 10.
Fair enough.
It looks
Yeah,
like
but this still ends up being an optimization for the case where you have a non-countable list of T and you want to avoid allocations until the very end.
I don't think these people care about avoiding allocations, though.
Yeah, no, they don't. Do we care about like consistency? Are there other methods in System Link that return arrays?
There are. They're normally called toArray. But yeah, whenever there are APIs in Link that actually return concrete data structures, array, dictionary, list, and so on, and those methods are all called to the name of the data structure. I can mention.
Like, I would think,
and I think those are, if memory serves, those are the only ones that materialize arrays that are handed out, or other data structures in any form that are handed out.
Sure, and that's
all
why
the other implementations are internal types that you can't cast to.
And that's why the suggestion was as chunked arrays. The word arrays in it, now it's allowed to return an array.
But that kind of still feels inconsistent. Like, if the whole point isn't just to return an IEnumerable to an array, like, if it's doing something else, then, like, why throw in the toArray in there? Like, why not make that explicit when you consume the chunks?
Quite frankly, group by is kind of like that already, right? Group by is not that lazy either.
Yeah, I mean, the other alternative, which no one would ever find, is we add an overload of toArray that takes that returns an IEnumerable of arrays and takes what's the biggest size any array would be, and then your scenario on that is you just are trying to avoid the large object heap. But I think that'll have a discoverability problem.
Yeah, so I don't know. Like, my gut feel tells me IEnumerable of T array is probably more useful than IEnumerable of T, even how most people will end up using this API. But it's just based on my own needs. Whenever I needed chunking, I ended up creating arrays. Like, I almost never had the streaming thing, but I also was never an RX user, right? So keep that in mind as well. So one thing we can do, we can just push it back with needs work, and then somebody comes back with actual sample code.
Is there a precedent for us having a Core Effects Lab-like package where we put a bunch of experimental link methods that we're not sure if we're committed to and we just want to get feedback on them?
I mean, I don't think you will get feedback on these things. I mean, the cost of shipping this thing, it's and then having people use it, I think seems much higher than just asking people to comment on this issue.
How many users will end up accidentally or more unintentionally using this API because ReSharper refactors their for loop via suggestion to use this after we ship it?
Not that many. I mean, like, how would you? Like, I have a hard time seeing ReSharper being that smart that they can detect that what you're doing there is chunking and then reverse engineer that you should write chunk.
I mean, see that you're calling take a loop.
Their linkification stuff is pretty good at taking for loops and converting it.
Yeah, but now we're talking about like potentially nested loops with builders and like I don't know, like that seems. I'm skeptical. That I mean, but even then, I mean, honestly, like how often have I done this? I've very often applied the ReSharper refactoring and then just said no, I don't want this, and then undo, right?
Yeah. To summarize a comment from YouTube chat, it looks like one of the use cases is basically partitioning for Plink. I mean, they didn't say Plink, but here, slice this in chunks of up to like 10 things each, and now throw each of those sub-chunks off at a different thread. And then again, it's unclear if then the answer is how often do you want to. I feel that probably it's if you started with a countable thing, you want a countable thing, and if you started with a loose thing, then you may not care. But if that's if partitioning or parallel partitioning is all that you care about, but
I guess it also depends on what max size ends up being, right? Assuming max size is usually values less than 100, it probably array is fine. If these might be ginormous, then probably an IEnumber would have been nicer, right? But like my gut feel is that, you know, based on what you normally do with these things is either batching or I guess batch would be a good word for this API as well. And I'm thinking about this, but like basically that's how I normally use it, right? And then you just take the entire thing and submit it all in one go. So it probably doesn't matter whether you do 2-array or IEnumber.
So what's the issue with doing both and then having the array one just be the enumerable one dot select x to array?
Poor Eric has to maintain everything.
Wouldn't it effectively be the same implementation under the hood either way? It's just one is caching the IEnumerable and the field, and the other one is just doing the arrays.
I don't know, like my only pushback is that I think one of them is used a lot and the other one is used by accident. So I'm just not convinced anybody wants the chunked one to be lazy. That's my only pushback. But yeah, I don't like if they came up with a nice naming for it, like sure.
I don't feel particularly strongly, but it was the first question from 3 or 4 of the API review members, so.
Yeah, but that I think is just us staring at the signature. I think that's just.
Yeah, we are not our own consumers here. Like this is one of the few APIs that I think we're not our own consumers.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So YouTube chat and one of the last comments on the issue did also suggest the name batch emo, so you're in good company. I mean, if we want to do IEnumerable of T batch, then sure. People who care about the arrays can call to array, as Steve pointed out.
I mean, I also, like Tanner, don't feel strongly. It's just weird to me. Like, this is the first time people have added such an API that isn't sort of enumerable based as part of a processing method rather than an end method. And it seems strange, but like no one in .NET Runtime is going to use this anyway, so.
Right.
Would it be okay if it was IEnumerable of iRead-only list of T?
I mean, at that point, you might as well make a T array. Like,
But
I mean,
you don't have to allocate.
why would you have to allocate? Like,
You
like
can
I mean, you
reuse them,
can't.
just like you
No, why can you reuse it? I mean, like as soon as you give people out an instance, I mean, they can add it to something else, and now if they use the instance twice to get different results, that would be bad, right?
Isn't that what we were talking about doing with IEnumerable of IEnumerable? Or no?
I guess, but like I mean, storing an IEnumerable seems less problematic because people normally don't do that. But like if you imply it's a persistent thing, which if you say I read only list or I list or some variant thereof, you're kind of conveying to your caller that it's materialized already. So like it would be very weird if I can't store them.
I agree. I can't explain why, but I agree.
Like I agree with you that on IEnumerable it's equally fishy, but I don't know. IEnumerable is this kind of hot potato that everybody wants to like drain, right? Like you don't want to store them for later usually. It's warm food. It wants to be consumed while still warm.
Yeah.
Like you don't want to store it and then iterate over it at some point. I think the biggest reason is because people don't assume they can it multiple times. Like I think as soon as you store, you want to kind of like drain it and then say, no, I can enumerate it as many times as I want.
But yeah, to go back to the person who wanted to do partitioning for parallel operations, if we're writing it as an efficient thing, they would still need to call to array, because if we reuse the same thing for the second batch or chunk or whatever we feel like calling it, like they just sent literally the same list to all of their worker threads. So for the parallel case, they do want it to be distinct memory, and that's probably hard to observe.
I will say, having like written this method quite a few times, like it always ends up being arrays, and I cannot give a better reason than chunks feel like they should be arrays in the first place. And in most of my applications, which were scheduling partitioned workloads, in most of those cases, I forgot what I was gonna say, but basically array felt like the natural choice. The allocation of the array wasn't actually a dominating factor in what I was implementing in any case. So if there was any additional copying by virtue of the fact that you're exposing it as an array, that didn't really show up in my applications.
So let's make a decision. So to move this forward, like we can do either enumerable of T array, we can do enumerable of enumerable of T. I have a slight preference for the T array one, but I will also not die on that hill.
I think if we make IEnumerable of T efficient, then it's a usability trap, and if we make it an array, then the people who care about performance just won't call it, and so I would go with the array.
And by
People
that,
who care about performance aren't going to use it anyway.
Right. So returning the array is honest and easy, and if you want better memory performance, write it yourself.
Okay, so then should we rename the method to batch or should we leave it at chunk? Okay, one at a time. One at a time.
It looks like we use the term chunk more than batch, particularly when it involves collections. For example, in collections concurrent, we use chunking. We also use it in a few other places like the streams, whereas batches looks to be more limited. It's mostly in code dump so far from what I see.
Are you talking about public API or internal implementation detail?
It looks like public API, but I'm not positive.
I mean, we have some, but I mean, usually when we see chunking, it has to do with encoding more than anything.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't explain this, but to me, chunking feels like colloquialism that we use when we talk about implementation, not something that we normally talk in APIs.
Yeah, I think batch might be better.
Would we consider buffer?
As an RX?
Yeah.
I feel that if I wanted this behavior, buffer would not be a word that I would have ever thought of as having this behavior.
What about partition or segment?
Yeah, we thought about partitioning earlier. To me, segment and partitioning is kind of similar. Like in both, I kind of think there's a selector, like some sort of criteria that decides which bucket this goes into. Like batching to me is very strong. It's size based. Buffer is a bit too stored.
Partition, I do feel like it wants a criteria, but segment, I don't feel as strongly about.
I should point out that I have an upcoming API proposal that proposes a completely different method called partition, and it does accept a delegate.
Okay,
so
then let's not
maybe
do
to make it
partition.
clear that it doesn't take a delegate, could we do something based on take? The problem is I don't know what it'd be. Like take repeated doesn't sound great, but
I mean, take chunks would work, but
we've got string builder.chunk enumerator, which is public.
Yeah, I guess the problem with these kind of things is that they're normally not seen, right? Because you write it for each loop. Like, I guess my question is still like, we all have used the term chunk at some point, but would that be a term you would be looking for in the API? That's kind of my question.
Data flow uses batch.
I would say that if I saw a method called chunk in IntelliSense, I would probably understand immediately what it was supposed to be doing. So maybe that partially answers your question.
Yeah, it's just that when you're when you're dotting into an enumerable, you have like 400 of those. So
fair enough.
Indeed.
But at least it's starting with C, so it's somewhat early, right? Yeah, I guess if you look at it, I think it's obvious what it does. It's just not something I would be looking for.
Yeah.
But at the time, so you can probably just say the same thing about anything, right? Because it's a very specialized use case.
I think on the other hand, it's not entirely clear to me what either batch or buffer would mean. They seem more ambiguous.
Buffer, I agree. For batch, I think I would expect to just get batches back. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sold on either name. I mean, I can live with chunk as it's proposed here. Nobody has a problem with that. Chunk it is.
Yeah.
All right, then chunk, and then signature that we agreed on is enumerable of TRA. It takes an enumerable and a max size, and the name is just chunk, not chunk by, not anything else, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what about queryable?
Good question.
I don't feel like this is something that would be useful in iQueryable.
Don't we try to maintain parity?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Do we have parity for every public method?
I thought we had a test that would fail if we didn't. I could be wrong.
I guess I should know since I'm the owner, but I'm not. To be very honest, I don't know whether we do have parity or whether we test for it.
I mean, my other question is, what happens if we don't have parity? Is there any reason why bad things would happen? Like, you always start with an iQueryable or enumerable, right? You don't there are no places where one is converted to the other, right?
Well, is it iQueryable, iEnumerable?
Yeah, iQueryable extends iEnumerable, so we.
Right, but like if you call a method that does query-based processing, it only takes an iQueryable, right? So if I have an iEnumerable expression-based tree, right, rather than the instance of iEnumerable, I don't think I can pass it over, right?
Yeah, because I don't think that queryable would need it to replace the implementation is saying it's returning as another queryable, so maybe just letting it fall back to the IEnumerable version of. At this point, you've asked to walk it, and you just want it in 5 at a time. Seems correct.
Yeah, I guess not putting it on iQueryable would have the downside that it would fall back to IEnumerable silently at compile time, which means all of the evaluation would be. It would perhaps be a very chatty communication with the backend server when you were expecting it to be very optimized because you were using iQueryable everything.
Yeah, it seems to me that's something that we asked last time, I think, as well. Like, I think Eric should probably look into this, and like we should have clarity on whether we need to maintain parity and what happens if we don't.
I think what happens is everything still works, it just gets a lot less efficient.
But I can't think of any way that... I guess queryable could maybe be more efficient on this, because you could, assuming that everything on queryable is interceptable, you could then have your own batching semantics that you're tying into on your backend or whatever. Hey, I've asked for things in chunks of 10. Give me things 10 at a time.
Yeah, for iQueryable, this will be implemented as just a bunch of skip, take, and then to array. But yeah, because this could easily be implemented for iQueryable using existing iQueryable infrastructure. I mean, we approved the iQueryable version of not the try get enumerated count, the one we did a few minutes ago that I'm blanking on.
And actually, because we made it an extension method on IEnumerable, it means it will show up for iQueryables, which means that previous extension method we either need to decide explicitly and then make the test okay, or would need to add it for queryable.
Yeah, and I guess the rationale for adding the iQueryable overload for that previous issue was that we would much rather have the query provider throw if it doesn't recognize the particular method.
Okay, how about this then? So we only have 1 minute left. So let's say we write in the issue looks good as proposed, and then the only action item is we need to settle down on the parity with IEnumerable, between iQueryable and IEnumerable. That seems like a general good thing for Eric to research and ask clarity on for future editions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then let me just paste this under API needs work, so that we have just a follow-up for this. And then this way we misuse this issue here for tracking this. All right.
Can I add one last comment? Sorry. Is max size the right name for that int parameter? It seems to imply that the size could be less than max size, but it only will be that in a very specific case of the very last chunk. Why wouldn't we just call it size?
I'm okay with either, but...
Or a chunk size, if we want to specify, be more specific.
Yeah, but chunk size really just feels like it's chunk of size. So.
I think the max size just makes it that tiny bit clearer that it could be smaller. And that also leaves the implementation free to adjust itself in the future around UTF-8 or UTF-16 string splitting if we determine that's actually necessary.
But if you tell me that this doesn't actually always, like, if I pass in 10 here, are you saying I could get 9 back? I could, instead of 10, 10, 10, 3, I could get 9, 8, 7.
Yeah, it seems bad. Yeah, I think the expectation of this API is the only thing that can be less than max size is the last one, right? Everything else must be guaranteed to be the max size, right? Otherwise, like, what the fuck does this API do, right?
Yeah,
Well,
I think that's something that we talked about earlier when we talked about like what happens if you call this on string. Do we like try to avoid surrogate characters and stuff like that? It's like, no, that'll just throw off what people expect of this API.
Agreed.
Yeah. So I mean, we can call it size.
Yeah, it can go either way.
But yeah, I would go size or max size, but not chunk size. Chunk size feels redundant.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm looking at string.split just as an example of an API that already does something similar to this. They use count, and they don't guarantee that they return count elements in the array. It's just treated as a max. Granted, here count is probably ambiguous because is count the outer or the inner count? But yeah.
Yeah. All right, so then let's leave it at this, and then just say let's review this next week when Eric did some digging.
Cool.
I think you saw that I added another set of meetings. I hope nobody is offended by that, but like it seems like no matter what we do, we just hover at 30. So at some point we want to get the numbers down. It seems like we need more meetings to do that. Alrighty. See you in a bit.
Ciao.
Bye.